Okay, this is Block 9, the Liberal Establishment, Section 5, the Cold War Beyond Vietnam, with the winds of change. One of there was massive changes on the world map in the decades following the Second World War. The biggest change was in the fact that all of the European powers, with very few exceptions, gave up the vast majority of their colonies in Africa and Asia. And the term winds of change was a term used by British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan in a speech in 1960. And Harold Macmillan kind of said the winds of change are blowing and European empires are no longer tenable. And they're no longer tenable for lots of reasons. That in the colonial period, when Europe was so far ahead of the rest of the world technologically, you could hold on to vast colonies without much effort really at all. That at the height of the British Empire, 5,000 Englishmen, ruled all of India, which is a very, very small number of people. Wilsonian ideas of self-determination inspire, people who live in Africa and Asia to fight for their own national independence. The elites of the colonies, the elites of the native people who live in those colonies go to college in Europe, go to college in the United States, where they learn about things like the Declaration of Independence, they learn about things like self-determination. So there are nationalist movements in almost every colony. In every colony, there are movements of people demanding independence from their colonial powers. Modern weapons are flooding these countries after World War II. After World War II, there are a lot of weapons in the world. And these weapons are purchased by these nationalist movements, which evens the odds. We're not any longer talking about a colonial war in 1880 where, the Zulu tribesmen have, spears and shields against the machine guns of the British. Now we're talking about the people who live, in the colonies. They have the same pretty much type of modern technology, at least modern weapons, as the European powers do. So to fight them becomes incredibly more expensive. The economies of all of the European countries are destroyed after World War II. Maintaining colonies is expensive. The European countries simply cannot afford to keep the colonies anymore, even if they were relatively peaceful. Colonies are unaffordable, colonies are unworkable, and in the eyes of many, colonies are also immoral. It is no longer considered moral for countries to have colonies. That white man's burden as a concept is out. The Holocaust had a lot to do with this. The Holocaust turns people off, to racism in any form in lots of different ways. And for a group of, white Frenchmen to be ruling, millions of black African subjects began to be seen not as beneficial, but as immoral. That French people had no right, British people had no right to rule people who were not like them. These vast colonial empires disappeared, almost overnight. That India was granted its independence in 1947, Burma 1948, all of French West Africa, 1960, 1962, 1961, 1963, 1956, 1964. Within 20 years, pretty much, of the end of World War II, the imperial powers are no longer imperial powers. Their colonies have all either won their independence in battle or were granted their independence by the colonial powers. So then the question became, okay, what do we do with these places in the world that are not nearly as advanced and prosperous and free as the rest, as the industrialized world? That, 100 years of British control of India did not turn India into Great Britain. That there was still incredible poverty in India. What kind of governments are going to be set up? How are these countries going to achieve self-sufficiency? And a theory was put forward called Modernization Theory. Modernization Theory provided the theoretical underpinnings of the United States kind of getting involved in all of these former colonies. That modernization theory that said that underdeveloped post-colonial countries, you pick them, it doesn't matter which one, they're all, lumped together, that post-independence, underdeveloped countries could become prosperous and free by following the same path that made the United States prosperous and free. That if those countries would only do what the United States did, they too would become prosperous and free. This is successful to a degree, that the poverty in the rest of the world is not nearly as bad as it was 50 years ago. Lots of these countries now are economic success stories, some of them. India is the world's largest democracy, has a vast middle class, still has a ton of poverty. The British colonies tended to do a little better than the other countries' colonies, but Africa and Asia had significant problems in the decolonialization period. But overall, like, these post-colonial countries are still, in general, the world's poorest countries. Why did modernization theory not necessarily work? Well, there's vast cultural differences. There's a big gulf between culturally being Dutch and culturally being Indonesian. So you're just talking about different cultures, different values, different ways of setting up societies. The third world experienced incredibly rapid population growth. Better hygiene, better health care, higher standard of living, taking care of diseases, shots, immunizations, penicillin, serves to make people live longer and babies die less often. So for the 20 years after decolonialization, the population of these countries just exploded. And all of a sudden, a country that used to have 20 million people living in it now has 80 million people living in it. 80 million people who need to eat, who need jobs, etc., etc. It makes it hard for a country to get ahead. But the United States constantly was involved with these countries, that there was a Cold War competition for influence in these countries, and the United States gave hundreds of billions of dollars in total to helping these countries get on their feet economically through that idea of modernization theory.